And I am going to bring on my next guest. We are joined with Professor Richard Wolff. He is Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a visiting professor at the Graduate Program for International Affairs of the New School University in New York City. He is founder of Democracy at Work and hosts the nationally syndicated show Economic Update. His latest book, and this is probably old, I would imagine this is probably another book, but Capitalism, When the System is the Sickness, when capitalism fails to save us from pandemics and itself. Professor, welcome to the show. Always enjoy having you. How you doing today? You doing all right?
I'm doing all right, Jamal. I really am. I'm a little bit blown away by the headlines every day now since the 20th of January, but it's beginning to shape up into a understandable pattern.
Give me your take on the sanction war, tariff war that Donald Trump has effectively enacted against the entirety of the world. He is apparently doing metals in addition to going after Canada, going after Mexico, going after Europe. They're all taking advantage of us. Poor America. We were just standing here being the good statesmen of the world, helping protect the world, and they're taking advantage of us. They're taking our stuff. And now we need to do something in order to push back on this world that has been taking advantage of America. That is the argument that Trump is making. And he seems to be single-handedly trying to reshape the international order in the way things operate. It's fascinating to watch. Give me your take, the take from an economist, on this idea of tariffs, and would tariffs accomplish what Trump is trying to accomplish? And just to add a little bit more into it, it seems that what he's trying to do is to bring jobs back to the United States and use tariffs as a way to encourage companies to bring those jobs back. Am I getting that right? And that's what he seems to be trying to do. And will he be able to accomplish that objective?
Everything you said is right, Jamal. There's really not much debate about pretty much everything you said. There are people who like it and don't like it and all the rest, but there isn't much of a dispute that seems to be what he's doing. If that's correct, as most people see it, and as you just summarized it, then my judgment as a professional economist is that no way is he going to accomplish it. And now let me explain briefly. You slipped at the very beginning of what you said when you used the word sanctions, and then you corrected yourself and you said tariffs. But you're right to link those two. I would ask you, stay there, and let me show you why. When Russia invaded the Ukraine early in 2022, the then government of the United States, President Biden, etc., realized two things. Number one, the big nuclear power that the United States military had assembled was useless. They could not threaten Russia with that because Russia has nuclear weapons too, as many or maybe more than we do. And a nuclear war is one in which everybody loses. So that's out. The second possibility was to fight a conventional war against Russia. And that was determined to be part of the story, but the history of people invading Russia is a history of one loser after another. Napoleon did it and got defeated. Hitler did it and got defeated. I mean, I could go on, but there's enough memory at West Point, at least among the history professors, that they could advise the government, whoa, think long and hard. These people fight back and they win. Okay, and then it was decided we can beat them if we combine the United States and Europe, giving the Ukrainians the money and the weapons to fight the Russians. And one more thing, sanctions. I want to remind you, suddenly Europe stopped buying Russian oil and gas, which is what the Russian economy puts a lot of emphasis on. So that was a heavy blow against Russia. And the people in Washington, the neocons, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the President Biden, all of them were confident that the sanctions war, that kind of economic warfare, would win the day.
Right.
And I quote you, bring Russia to its knees. I quote you again, make the ruble, the Russian currency, valueless, and so on. Now, none of that happened. The ruble didn't collapse. Russia's economic growth over the 3 years of the war is greater than that of the United States. It didn't cripple Russia, quite the contrary. And perhaps most important, Russia basically has won the war. In the last 3 or 4 days, the leading officials of the United States, from Trump on down, have pretty much acknowledged that. Most of the rest of the world already knew. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because Mr. Trump's tariff war is very similar to, and therefore will likely have the same outcome as the sanctions war. Namely, it will fail. Let me explain briefly. A tariff is a unilateral act. It's the equivalent of somebody who used to play nicely, a child in elementary school, who used to play nicely with the other kids, sharing the trucks in the sandbox, etc., who suddenly turns around, grabs a stick, and hits everybody to get them to do what he wants. It becoming a bully. The best example is the tariffs, 25%, which is a very big tariff, that was levied against Mexico and Canada. The United States signed a treaty. Back in the 1990s, President Clinton signed a treaty known as NAFTA. In the first presidency of Mr. Trump, from 2016 to 2020, he revised that series, that the treaty, and then Mr. Trump, as president, signed the treaty that extended NAFTA. The central provision of that treaty was that these 3 countries, Canada, Mexico, and the US, would have no tariffs between them, that anything produced in Canada could be sent to the United States or Mexico. No tax, no tariff would be attached to it. That's why it was originally called the North American Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Trump unilaterally, without conversation, without discussion, without diplomatic exchanges, simply violated the treaty. The treaty that bears, notice the irony here, his personal signature as president. He simply ignored it. He broke the treaty. And he breaks treaties, once or twice a day. It is a remarkable act, and it will have long-term consequences. And now think with me. Any company planning on doing any kind of business in the United States or in Mexico or in Canada used to be able to count on producing something and then selling it in Canada or Mexico or United States without a tariff.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to want to do business. It's too risky to do business here. You got a man who is making treaties and breaking treaties with no more interest or concern than having more or less cream cheese on his bagel. This is ridiculous. You can't function like this in an interdependent world. Let me give you another example. You're right. He justifies this behavior as though it's going to bring jobs back to the United States. Let me comment. every one of the last dozen presidents in the United States have promised that they would do that. And every one of the last dozen presidents has failed to deliver on his promise. What that suggests is that the reasons why people produce elsewhere rather than the United States are more powerful than whatever it is the president can do. Mr. Trump ought to give us a reason why we should believe him when his predecessors, Republican and Democrat alike, couldn't do it. Next step, and then I'll stop because once you wind me up, I'm a little bit like a clock. I don't know how to stop. Anyway, imagine yourself a producer, an American company, or it doesn't matter. It could be a European company producing in China, okay, or producing in, doesn't matter, Canada, Mexico, and suddenly they're confronted by a tariff.
Mm-hmm.
A tariff is just a tax. It's a name of the tax you apply to anything imported from outside into your country. I want to note in passing that for 100 years, the Republican Party defined itself as the party that opposes taxes. It went to the voters and said, vote for us, we'll cut your taxes. It went to the business community and promised them, we won't tax you. And indeed, even Mr. Trump in his first presidency, the only significant economic act he got passed was the tax cut of December 2017. Now look at this party. They are the party of tariffs. Mr. Trump celebrates tariffs. He throws tariffs, as you put it, at the whole world. The tariff is a tax. We're watching the Republican Party reverse 100-year history and become the party of taxes, in particular the tariff tax. This is weird. This is strange. You have to explain something as big a shift as this. They explain nothing. It's as if they want to sneak it by everybody that we used to be against taxes. Now we are the biggest taxer in the world. You can't do that. The rest of the world is noticing it. And they notice, therefore, that if they're a capitalist busy in China, Mr. Trump is telling us if he puts tariffs on, they'll leave China and bring the jobs back here. No, they won't. And they won't because good business not to do that. First of all, moving production is very expensive. It disrupts all your supply chains. It takes usually years, that's a plural, years to get that done. You don't do that quickly or lightly. Yet they would have to worry that Mr. Trump, who has put the 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, and when he did it, he didn't say he was going to take it back 3 days later. He did. Now he tells us he's going to put it on March 1st. Yeah, maybe he will. Then again, maybe he won't. Then again, maybe a week or a month later, he'll. No capitalist in his right mind is going to incur the expenses of moving production all the way back here when you've got an on again, off again, and you can't count on what he does or when he does it. And now the last thing, which is probably the most important. Capitalists left the United States, thousands of them, and moved production overseas.
Right.
Over a 30-year period, roughly 1980 to roughly 2010-12. So first of all, moving over there took decades. It's not something you get done. If you get it done, Takes a long time. Number two, they had two basic reasons. Endless surveys show this. Number one, the wages you have to pay a worker in China or India or Brazil was then and still is way lower than the wages you have to pay an American worker. So if you're a business, the president wants you to leave the country you went to enjoy low wages in order to come back and pay high wages. That is the opposite of what capitalist employers ever do. I've taught in business schools. We teach the students, go, if you want to make it big in business, go where the wages you pay are low and where the market is growing. The biggest, fastest growing market in the world is the People's Republic of China. And so the American capitalists went there to take advantage of low wages and a big expanding market, bigger than the US now and expanding way faster than the US. So why should they come back? They're going to discover higher wages is not a road to success. They're going to discover that there will also be retaliation. You come back here to produce. Don't imagine that all the rest of the world is going to say, oh, well, that's nice for you, and we won't do anything. They're going to do what the Chinese have already done. They put tariffs. It's called a retaliatory tariff, which means Americans producing here are going to be closed out of the market in China, as China does to the U.S. what the U.S. already did to China. You put all this together, and I would say if you're a betting man or woman, don't bet on the success of Mr. Trump. What he's doing is a lot of theater and hand waving, and he's Mr. Tough Guy, and he's reorganizing the world. My guess is it will do as well as the sanctions war did against Russia in Ukraine.
I think if someone was pro-Trump, they would listen to you, and I think you're absolutely right. But they would say, okay, well, Wolff, as one of my people in the audience said, is arguing for lower wages. That what Trump is trying to do in the tariff war is believing that the U.S. has this kind of weight and leverage that it would be able to, if not necessarily force workers back into the United States, to try to level the playing field in regards to wages that we pay, let's say here in the U.S. versus wages that they pay there. Basically, he is looking out at the world and is saying to himself, what leverage do I have at my disposal to do what I said I was going to do? And he's also, as you pointed out, previous presidents who have said the exact same thing. We're going to bring jobs back and failed at doing it. And he looks at it and says, okay, well, they were never aggressive enough. I have tariff leverage. I have leverage. I'm going to use that leverage in order to bring back jobs and to ensure that American wages, or that at very least wages are higher. How do you contest that? Because there is a globalist argument built into this on some level, versus getting workers here and having that work done here in the US. And as you pointed out, it takes years. Trump has been all over the place. So no, I highly doubt that they're going to take the word of somebody who's unreliable, who's only going to be here 4 years, as a rationale to move jobs back. But there is something to say about the fact that something needs to be done. What needs to be done? And then I guess that's two questions. The first one is, what do you say to the audience member that points out, okay, well, this sounds like an argument for lower wages? And in second front, I'll ask after that question, but I'll preempt it. What do you do then? He clearly needs to do something. This was a campaign pledge, and he seems to be going all out to fulfill this campaign pledge. Let's go to the first one, though.
Okay.
Are you arguing for lower wages in this?
No, I mean, anyone who knows who I am and what side of the political spectrum I'm on, I'm always arguing for higher wages. I'm never, ever. Lower wages is what capitalists want. Higher wages are what the majority of Americans want. I'm with the majority. I want higher wages. But let me acknowledge that your audience member makes a good point. One of the ways Mr. Trump might have tried to do what he's doing is by smashing down workers' wages. The problem is he would lose every election and he would suddenly be unable to do anything if he dared to do that. You can't do that politically in the United States. Let me remind everyone Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris by 1.5% of the votes cast in this country. The reason he keeps talking about a mandate is because he doesn't have one. And he has to talk it up in the hope that people either don't know or won't remember that this was a close election, not a blowout or anything like that. 1.5% more votes were for Mr. Trump than for Kamala Harris. This is a country that split pretty much 50-50 in the last election. If he dared to propose, as of tomorrow, everybody takes a 20% wage cut, they'd laugh him out of office or do it in another not so funny way. So he can't do that. And by the way, let's remember, one of the most important things that got people to vote for him was the upset in the United States among working class people about the inflation. Letting prices go up more than wages, which is what we did in 2021, 2022, and so forth. That's what lost the election for the Democrats, who were blamed for this. He is going to be blamed too if he dared to allow prices to go up. And one of the things to worry about is when you put a tax on imported goods, it means the cost of them here in the United States goes up, and that worsens the inflation. People aren't talking about that as much as they should, but it is a very dangerous thing. Mr. Trump couldn't attack the American working class. He figured he had a better chance by attacking the rest of the world. That's a long shot. That's a Hail Mary pass, and you have no idea whether any of your teammates are going to be in the neighborhood of where you're flinging this football. So for me, I see the rest of the world now as in a very different place from what it used to be. 40 years ago, before all this started, maybe the United States then had the global position, the power, and the wealth to bully the rest of the world. But now, I'm telling you with all the emphasis I can, it's way too little and way too late. It's over. The China and its allies, the so-called BRICS countries that I know you've discussed, they together are much wealthier than the United States and its G7 partners. And that only became true in the year 2020. And ever since, the BRICS have gotten richer and the United States and its allies have not. And therefore, we can't do it. They can do without us more than we can do without them. And that reality is something Americans cannot wrap their heads around. And it's making them make big mistakes. When the sanctions war came down on Russia and Europe wouldn't buy its oil and gas and they were frozen out of the SWIFT international system, the Russians said, we're going to turn to our allies in the BRICS. The two big allies, there are many countries, but the two biggest ones are India and China. And guess what? India and China have purchased the oil and gas that Europe didn't. Boom, there goes the sanctions war. Fails right there. And if you think that the United States closing itself off with tariff tax walls will not result in the same global adjustment, then I don't know what planet you're living on because you're not paying attention.
I guess for the last question, I guess, so what is path on this? I mean, because clearly,
The
I
same
guess,
thing, Jamal, it really is the same thing. Sooner or later, the United States is going to have to sit down with the leaders of the People's Republic of China and cut a deal. Look, in the last 2 days, we have heard from Mr. Trump and from the people he's been sending to Russia. That's what they're about to do. Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump or their people are going to sit down and bring an end to that war in Ukraine because the West lost. And the Russians are sitting in the catbird seat because they're going to be able to tell us pretty much what has to happen. And the Americans know it. They'll cut the best deal they can. And that's how it's going to be resolved, because the bullying, the United States is not in the position it was. I want to remind folks, because it's so hard for America. I was born in the United States. I've lived here my entire life. I've worked here in my entire life. I'm an American citizen and proud of it. But I got to tell you, we lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the war in Afghanistan. We lost the war in Iraq. We're losing the one in Ukraine. You know what that suggests? We're not able to do what we used to be. We're still very powerful. We're still very rich. We still have a monstrous military. But, you know, the world changes. And what you could do with that before, you can't do with it now.
Professor Richard Wolff, my man, thank you for this. Professor Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and visiting professor at the Graduate Program in International Affairs at the New School University in New York City. He is founder of Democracy at Work, host of the nationally syndicated show Economic Update. His latest book, The System is the Sickness: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Professor, thank you for this. I really do appreciate it. I always enjoy these conversations. I always learn something from you in these. Very, very learned. Thank you.
Let me say, you know, and in no way to butter you up, but to be honest, your willingness to explore these issues without the usual taboo of the mainstream media is refreshing and could not be more of a contribution at this point in our history. We're facing the difficult task of adjusting to an empire that's declining. That's always hard. That's not unique to ours. But it is a tough moment, and it needs people willing to be honest. And I appreciate your program because you are.
Oh, thank you. I deeply appreciate that. You've informed my workable point of view. I think I pointed that out before.
All right.
So hearing that, I appreciate it. Thank you. You have a good one. Be safe.
You too.